It's 11 p.m. You're lying in bed. The room is dark. The house is quiet. And you're having the argument again. Not with the person, with the memory of the person. You're saying the thing you should have said. You're finally winning. And somewhere across town, they're asleep. That's the thing nobody names directly. The people who hurt you don't carry it home. You do. You replay the meeting where your idea got dismissed, like it was nothing. You rehearse what you'll say next time to the colleague who talks over you. You run the tape of the conversation with your partner, pausing it, rewinding it, editing your lines, and none of it changes anything. But you keep going. Because your brain has convinced you that if you just think about it hard enough, you'll arrive somewhere. You won't. The replay isn't processing. It's a loop. Here's what that loop is costing you. Not in some abstract, long-term sense. Tonight. Right now. The sleep you're losing. The mental energy burning on a person who has already forgotten the interaction. The version of yourself that could have been thinking about something that actually matters. Gone. Spent. Handed over without being asked. I've done this. Longer than I'd like to admit. Replayed conversations with people who weren't worth a single round, let alone 30. What this book is about isn't anger management. It isn't toxic positivity. It isn't learning to smile while people mistreat you. It's something more precise than any of that. It's about understanding why certain people can reach inside you and pull a reaction out, and then systematically dismantling that mechanism. Wire by wire. You're not broken for getting triggered. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. But built for survival and built for your actual life are two very different specifications. And most people never stop to notice the gap. By the end of this, you won't be unfeeling. You'll be unsteerable. There's a difference. And it matters more than anything else you'll read this year. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. Your brain is lying about the threat. The most emotionally reactive people you know probably think of themselves as logical. That's not a coincidence. The people who trust their minds the most are often the least prepared for what their minds do under pressure. Because logic is a slow process. And what happens when you get triggered is fast. Faster than thought. Faster than choice. Here's the actual sequence. Someone says something that lands wrong. Before you've consciously decided it bothers you, before you've even finished hearing the sentence, your amygdala has already fired. Stress hormones are already moving through your bloodstream. Your chest is already tighter. Your jaw is already set. By the time your rational mind shows up to assess the situation, the verdict has been delivered. Your body already decided this was a threat. The amygdala doesn't have a nuance setting. It was built for a world where threats were physical, immediate, and binary. A predator or not. Danger or safe. It wasn't built for a passive-aggressive email from your manager. It wasn't built for the friend who makes a comment about your choices at dinner. But it treats all of it the same way. Maximum alert. Flood the system. Prepare to fight or flee. And here's what that flooding actually does. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for judgment, perspective, and impulse control, goes partially offline. Not metaphorically, measurably. The blood flow shifts. The cognitive resources redirect. You become, in a very literal neurological sense, less intelligent in the moment you most need to think clearly. This is why you say things in arguments you don't mean. This is why you send the email you regret 20 minutes later. This is why you replay the conversation at 11 p.m. and think of exactly the right response. Because by then, your prefrontal cortex is back online. The threat has passed, and suddenly you can think again. Look, understanding this doesn't automatically fix it, but it changes something important. Because most people experience a trigger and conclude something about themselves, that they're too sensitive, too weak, too emotional. They make the reaction mean something about their character. It doesn't. It means your nervous system is working. The question is whether you're going to keep letting it run the show. The brain's alarm system operates on pattern recognition. It doesn't evaluate each situation fresh. It matches the current moment against stored templates, past experiences, old wounds, learned associations. So when your boss uses a certain tone, your system doesn't just respond to the tone. It responds to every other time that tone meant something bad was coming. You're not just reacting to now. You're reacting to then, playing out through now. Neuroscientists call this sensitization. The more you've reacted to something, the lower the threshold gets for the next reaction. Every time you got hijacked by that particular trigger, you made the wire a little more sensitive. You didn't choose that, but you did reinforce it, and you can unreinforce it, not through willpower, but through deliberate repetition of a different response, which is what the rest of this book is about. But first, sit with the actual mechanics for a moment. There's a 12-millisecond gap between stimulus and amygdala response. Your prefrontal cortex needs about 24 milliseconds to process the same input. That means your emotional brain is literally twice as fast as your rational brain, every single time. This is not a personal failing. This is the architecture. You are working with hardware that was designed for a world that no longer exists. The uncomfortable thing, and you'll recognize this as true the second you hear it, is that you've been outsourcing your emotional state to other people without realizing it. Someone walks in with a bad mood, and suddenly you have a bad mood. Someone challenges your idea in a meeting, and suddenly your whole nervous system is in emergency mode over a comment that lasted 4 seconds. You gave them the controls. You didn't mean to, but you did. Here's what changes when you understand the biology. You stop taking the initial reaction as truth. You start treating it as data, not as a verdict on the situation, but as a signal that your system has been activated. The signal is real. The story your system is telling about why it's been activated, that part needs verification. There's a practice that elite performers in high-pressure environments use. First responders, surgeons, hostage negotiators. They call it different things, but the structure is the same. When they feel the activation, the tightening, the rush, the urgency, they've trained themselves to insert one beat before responding. Not a long pause, a breath, a deliberate shift in posture, something physical that tells the nervous system, I heard you. I'm not ignoring you, and I'm taking it from here. That one beat is the entire game. Everything else, the techniques, the reframes, the communication strategies, all of it depends on your ability to create that single moment of space between what happened and what you do next. Without the pause, you're just running on the old software. With it, you have a choice. You don't build that pause through motivation or intention. You build it through repetition in low-stakes moments. the minor irritations, the small frustrations, the everyday moments where someone says something slightly annoying and your first instinct is to react. Those are your training ground. Each time you insert the pause there, you're strengthening the exact neural circuit you need when something genuinely hard happens. Your brain is not your enemy. It's an overprotective system that hasn't been updated in about 200,000 years. Your job isn't to fight it. It's to work with its architecture, to understand what it's doing and why, and then gently, consistently, redirect it toward responses that actually serve you. The reaction was never really about them. It was always about the gap between your nervous system and the present moment. Close that gap, and the person who used to hijack your entire afternoon becomes someone you can handle before lunch. Chapter 2. The Invisible Cost. Nobody tracks the person who made you angry at 9 a.m. is still running your 3 p.m. meeting. You just don't see it that way. You think you moved on. You didn't. You just stopped talking about it. You snapped at someone who didn't deserve it. You made a decision from a place of low-grade irritation that had nothing to do with the decision itself. You were physically present in 3 conversations and mentally absent from all of them because some part of your brain was still chewing on what happened this morning. That's not an emotional problem. That's a performance problem, a relationship problem, a life problem. Most people think of emotional reactivity as a social flaw, something slightly embarrassing that occasionally causes friction. They don't see it as a structural drain on everything they're trying to build. But run the actual numbers. Not financially, just temporally. How many hours a week do you spend mentally relitigating situations that are already over? How many decisions have you made while your judgment was compromised by an emotion you didn't even name? How many opportunities passed quietly while you were occupied with someone who wasn't worth the occupation? Nobody tracks this. That's what makes it so expensive. The cost is invisible, distributed, and chronic. It doesn't show up as one dramatic loss. It shows up as a slightly smaller version of the life you were supposed to be living. Here's the biology that makes it worse. Chronic stress, the kind produced by repeated emotional hijacking, physically alters your brain over time. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of your judgment and emotional regulation, shrinks under sustained cortisol exposure. The amygdala, your alarm system, enlarges, which means the more reactive you've been, the more reactive your brain is structurally primed to be. You've been making yourself more sensitive without knowing it. Every unmanaged trigger wasn't just a bad moment. It was a small renovation in the wrong direction. And it doesn't stay in your head. Chronic emotional reactivity shows up in your body. Elevated inflammation markers, disrupted sleep architecture, immune suppression. The research on this is not subtle. People who regularly experience anger and unresolved stress have measurably higher rates of cardiovascular disease. They age faster at a cellular level. When you let someone live rent-free in your head long enough, they start charging your body too. The career costs are particular, not because workplaces are delicate, they're not, but because emotionally reactive people are predictable, and predictable people are easy to manage, easy to manipulate, and easy to overlook. When your colleagues can map exactly which comments will set you off, they have leverage over you whether they use it consciously or not. The calmer person in the room always has more power. Not because they're smarter, because they're harder to read and harder to rattle. Here's the one that stings, and you'll know it's true. The moments in your life where you said something that damaged a relationship, burned a bridge, or closed a door, Almost none of them were calculated. They were reactive. They were the 12-millisecond amygdala speaking before the 24-millisecond prefrontal cortex could intervene. One triggered response, one moment of emotional hijacking, and then years of consequence. Reactivity doesn't feel like weakness when it's happening. That's the trap. It feels like justice. It feels like finally saying the true thing. It feels righteous and immediate and honest. And that feeling is exactly what makes it so costly. Because you're not wrong that something needed to be addressed. You're wrong about the timing, the method, and the state you were in when you addressed it. Think about someone you know who is genuinely calm. Not passive, not a pushover. Just steady. When things go sideways, they don't immediately contribute to the chaos. They take in the situation. They respond in a way that's recognizable as them, not as the situation acting through them. Now think about how much you trust that person, how much credibility they carry without announcing it, how much room they seem to have, mentally, emotionally, professionally. That's not personality. That's the compound interest of consistently not reacting. The opportunity cost of reactivity is where this gets almost mathematical. Every minute you spend processing someone else's bad behavior is a minute not spent on your work, your relationships, your creative output, your physical health. The person who triggered you has moved on. You're still holding the weight. You're paying interest on a debt they've forgotten they owe you. The shift that starts to fix this isn't a technique. It's a recognition. Other people's behavior is information about them. Your reaction to their behavior is information about you. Both things can be true simultaneously. And your job, the only job that actually matters here, is to manage your side of that equation. Not because they deserve your composure, because you deserve to keep it. When you stop leaking energy into every provocation, something quietly remarkable happens. The mental space that was occupied by resentment and replayed arguments becomes available for something else. For the first time in a while, your attention is yours again. And attention, directed deliberately, is the most valuable thing you own. Chapter 3. The observer inside you. You're in the middle of an argument. Your voice is louder than you intended. Your chest is tight. And for one strange second, maybe two, you watch yourself from somewhere slightly above the scene. You see your own face. You hear your own tone. You think, this isn't who I want to be right now. And then the moment closes, and you're back inside it, reacting again. That flash of awareness was not an accident. It was the most important psychological capacity you have, and almost nobody develops it on purpose. That moment of watching yourself, observing your own emotional state without being entirely consumed by it, is what psychologists call metacognition. The ability to think about your own thinking, to feel an emotion and simultaneously notice that you're feeling it. It sounds simple. It is not. Most people spend their entire lives inside their emotions without ever learning to step back far enough to see them clearly. Here's what detachment actually means, because it's been sold wrong for a long time. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you become cold or unreachable or removed from the texture of life. It means you develop enough internal space that emotions move through you rather than carrying you. You feel the anger. You just don't become it. The difference is physical. When you're fully inside an emotion, your body is the emotion. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, narrowed vision, your entire physiology is organized around the feeling. When you're observing the emotion, something loosens slightly. The breath gets a little more room. You can notice the tightness without adding to it. That small physical shift is the beginning of choice. Most people try to control their emotions by suppressing them, push them down, override them with logic, tell themselves they shouldn't feel this way. This doesn't work, and not just because it's psychologically unsound. It doesn't work because the emotion is still running in the background. Suppressed emotions don't disappear. They redirect. They come out sideways, later, at something that doesn't deserve them. The observer doesn't suppress. The observer witnesses. You feel the irritation rise, and instead of immediately acting on it or pushing it away, you simply note it. There's irritation here. That's all. No verdict on whether the irritation is justified. No decision about what to do with it yet. Just the clean recognition that something has activated in you, and you are not that activation. Buddhist teachers have a phrase for this: witness consciousness. The part of you that can watch your own mind the way you watch clouds move across the sky. The clouds are real. They're moving. But you're not a cloud. You're the sky they're moving through. This isn't mysticism. It's a functional description of how the prefrontal cortex relates to the amygdala when they're working together rather than the amygdala running the show alone. Here's something I've had to learn the hard way. The observer doesn't always show up when you need it most. You have to practice finding it in quiet moments, so it's available in loud ones. You build the observer through deliberate attention. Sit still for 5 minutes and watch your thoughts without following them. Notice when your mind drifts. Notice the sensation of noticing. That practice, boring as it sounds, is literally thickening the prefrontal cortex, strengthening the neural architecture of the observer, making it more available under pressure. The moment the observer arrives in a tense situation, you have a choice you didn't have before. Not a wide-open, comfortable choice. A narrow one, maybe, but a real one. You can respond instead of react. And responding, chosen behavior rather than automatic behavior, is how you stop being steerable by other people's moods and methods. Detachment also changes your relationship with other people's emotional states. When you're not constantly absorbing the energy in a room, you can read that energy more accurately. You become less like a sponge and more like a barometer. You register what's happening without being altered by it. And that makes you genuinely more useful to the people around you. Not less present, but more accurately present. There's a distinction worth drawing carefully. Detachment from outcomes is not the same as indifference to results. You can care deeply about what happens while releasing your grip on whether it happens exactly the way you planned. You can be invested in a relationship without needing the other person to behave in a specific way to validate that investment. The attachment that causes suffering isn't love. It's the insistence that things must look a certain way for you to be okay. When someone is rude to you, two things are true simultaneously. Their behavior is real, and what it means about you is almost entirely a story you're constructing in real time. The observer can hold both of those truths without collapsing into either one. It doesn't ignore the behavior. It doesn't catastrophize the meaning. It sees clearly. That clarity, unhurried, undefended, accurate, is what makes emotionally grounded people so difficult to manipulate. You can't hook someone who isn't grasping. You can't rattle someone who is watching the situation rather than drowning in it. The observer isn't a defense mechanism. It's a presence, and presence, quiet and consistent, is more powerful than any comeback you could have delivered. Chapter 4. What your triggers are actually tracking. Your triggers are not random. That's the thing people miss. They feel random, sudden, disproportionate, surprising even to yourself. But they're not. They are precise, they are targeted, and they are pointing at something specific inside you that has been waiting, sometimes for years, to be seen. The colleague who takes credit for your work doesn't just annoy you, they activate something. The friend who gives unsolicited advice doesn't just irritate you. They reach in and pull a reaction from somewhere deep. The stranger online who dismisses your opinion doesn't just get under your skin. They find a nerve that was already exposed. Your triggers are a map, and the destination on that map is always the same: an old wound that hasn't been fully named. This is uncomfortable to sit with, because it means the source of your suffering isn't entirely external. The person who triggers you is the occasion for the reaction. They are not the cause. The cause is older than them. It was there before you met them. They just happened to find the door. Think about what specifically gets activated when you're triggered. Not the surface emotion, the anger, the frustration, the hurt. What's underneath it? Because there's always something underneath it. The feeling of being invisible. The fear of being seen as incompetent. The old belief that you're too much, or not enough, or that people always eventually leave. The trigger is new. The wound it's touching is not. Here's the part that might sting, and sit with it before you dismiss it. The intensity of your reaction is almost never proportional to the present moment. It's proportional to the accumulated weight of every previous time you felt this way and didn't have the tools to process it. When you react at a level 8 to a level 3 situation, the extra 5 levels are coming from somewhere else. They're coming from the archive. Look, this doesn't mean the present situation isn't real. It is. Someone's behavior may genuinely be wrong, but your reaction to it is carrying extra freight. And until you identify what that freight is, where it came from, what it's protecting, you will keep overreacting to similar situations for the rest of your life. Different people, same trigger, same reaction, same confusion afterward about why it hit so hard. The diagnostic question is simple, though the answer rarely is. When you feel triggered, ask yourself, when is the first time I remember feeling exactly this way? Not this specific situation, this specific feeling, the powerlessness, the dismissal, the invisibility, the shame. Follow that thread back, because that's where the actual work is. This doesn't have to be a formal therapeutic excavation. It can happen in a journal, in a quiet moment after the activation has passed. You don't need to relive everything. You just need to name it. Naming is surprisingly powerful, not because it erases the wound, but because it separates you from it. Once you can say this is an old fear about being abandoned, not a present tense emergency, the trigger loses some of its voltage. The people who bother you most are, in a very real sense, your most accurate diagnosticians. They're not trying to help you, but they're showing you something precise. The things that don't trigger you are things you've made peace with. The things that do, those are the unfinished conversations with yourself. There's a reframe here that changes everything. Instead of asking, why do they keep doing this to me? Start asking, what is this person showing me about my own unresolved material? Not because they deserve the generosity of that question, but because you deserve the insight it produces. You're not absolving them. You're extracting the information that's actually useful to you. This also means that as you do this work, as you identify and process the old wounds your triggers are tracking, the triggers themselves lose power. Not all at once. Gradually. A situation that used to hijack your entire afternoon starts to register as a minor irritation. A comment that used to loop in your mind for hours gets released by evening. Not because you've become indifferent, because the wound underneath it is healing. Your triggers are not evidence of weakness. They're evidence of experience. Specifically, experience that left a mark. And marks are not permanent. They're the record of something that happened. Not a sentence. Not an identity. Not a prediction of how it will always be. The most liberated people you'll ever meet aren't people who were never hurt. They're people who know exactly where their soft spots are. They've named them. They've worked with them. And because of that, nobody can use those soft spots against them without them immediately knowing what's happening and why. That awareness is a kind of armor that looks nothing like armor. It's quiet. It's internal. And it is almost impossible to penetrate. Chapter 5. Rewiring the reaction. Your jaw is already tight. You haven't decided how to respond yet, but your body has already voted. The email is open in front of you. The words are sitting there, doing their work. And somewhere between reading the first line and reaching the end, something in you shifted, and not in the direction you'd choose. That tightness in your jaw is the moment, not the words on the screen, not the person who sent them. The moment is the tightness, because that's where the fork is. That's where you either follow the old wiring or begin to install something new. Most advice about emotional regulation starts too late. It arrives after the hijack, hands you a breathing technique, and sends you back in. That's not rewiring. That's crisis management. Real rewiring happens earlier, in the body, before the story has fully formed, in the narrow window between activation and action. Here's what's actually happening physiologically in that window. Your amygdala has fired. Cortisol and adrenaline are moving through your system. Your heart rate is climbing. Your breathing has gone shallow without you noticing. Your muscles have begun to tense, particularly in your jaw, shoulders, and stomach. All of this is happening before you've consciously decided anything. The body is already committed to a direction. The entry point for interruption is always physical, not cognitive. You cannot think your way out of a triggered nervous system, but you can breathe your way out. And the specific breath matters. A slow exhale, longer than the inhale, directly activates the vagus nerve, which signals the parasympathetic nervous system to begin dampening the stress response. Not eventually, within seconds. The exhale is the off switch. Most people in a triggered state are barely exhaling at all. So the first move, always, every time, is one deliberate, extended exhale. Not a dramatic sigh, not a performance. Just a quiet release of breath that's longer than what came in. 4 counts in. 6 counts out. That's it. That's the intervention. It sounds too simple to matter. It is not. The reason people resist this is because when you're triggered, the idea of pausing to breathe feels like surrender. It feels like letting the other person win. That feeling is the activation talking. The activation wants you to respond immediately, because that's what threat responses are designed to do. Speed. But speed is exactly what works against you in a social conflict. The person who pauses has already won the most important part of the exchange. They've kept their prefrontal cortex online. Once the breath creates a beat of space, the next move is to name what you're feeling. Not to the other person, internally. One word: angry, humiliated, dismissed, scared. Research from UCLA shows that labeling an emotion activates the prefrontal cortex and measurably reduces amygdala activity. The act of finding the word creates just enough cognitive engagement to interrupt the pure emotional flood. You are not suppressing the feeling, you are identifying it. And identification, brief as it is, restores the observer. Here's what this looks like in practice. You're in a meeting. Someone cuts across your point to make their own and takes credit for the core of what you were saying. You feel the heat rise. Instead of speaking immediately, you exhale slowly. You name it internally. That's humiliation. Just the word. And in the 2 or 3 seconds that took, something shifts. You're still feeling it, but you're no longer entirely inside it. You have a sliver of choice you didn't have a moment ago. That sliver is everything, because now you can ask one question. What do I actually want from the next 60 seconds? Not what do I want to say? What do I want to happen? The answer to that question almost never points toward the immediate reactive response. It points toward something more deliberate, more effective, more you. The third component of real-time rewiring is posture. This sounds peripheral. It is not. Your emotional state and your physical posture are in constant conversation. Hunched shoulders with a tight chest will maintain and deepen a stress response. Deliberately opening the chest, sitting up slightly, dropping the shoulders back and down, sends different signals to the brain. You are not pretending to feel calm. You are giving your nervous system the physical information it needs to begin moving in that direction. These 3 moves, the exhale, the label, the posture shift, take about 5 seconds combined. They will not eliminate the emotion. They will not resolve the situation. But they will restore enough of your rational capacity to respond rather than react. And that's the only thing you're trying to do in the moment. Buy 5 seconds of clarity. Everything else follows from there. The rewiring happens over time. Every time you execute this sequence instead of firing off an immediate reaction, you're strengthening a new neural pathway. You're making the pause more automatic. You're building the habit of choice at the exact moment when habit is hardest to override. Progressive repetition in low-stakes moments creates the reflex that's available when the stakes are high. The goal is not to become someone who never gets activated. That person doesn't exist. The goal is to shrink the distance between activation and recovery. Right now, maybe someone can ruin your afternoon with a single comment. With practice, they can't ruin your next 10 minutes. Eventually, they get 30 seconds. And those 30 seconds happen entirely inside you, invisible to everyone in the room. That invisibility is its own kind of power. You felt it, you moved through it, and you responded like someone who had all the time in the world. Chapter 6. The story. Your brain writes in 0.3 seconds. You didn't react to what they did. You reacted to the meaning you assigned it before you'd finished blinking. That's not a small distinction. That's the whole thing. Here's what actually happened. Your colleague didn't respond to your message for 3 hours. That's the event. 4 words. That's all that occurred in the external world. But by the time you checked your phone again, you had already constructed a narrative. Detailed, emotionally charged, and almost entirely fictional. They're annoyed with you. You said something wrong in the last meeting. They've been distant lately, and this confirms it. You're being pushed out. You can feel it. None of that happened. A message went unanswered for 3 hours. Your brain did the rest, and it did it in under a second. Without your permission, without your awareness, and with complete conviction. This is the mechanism that sits underneath almost every unnecessary conflict, every misread situation, every relationship that eroded over misunderstandings that were never actually examined. Your brain does not wait for complete information before generating a story. It takes partial data, matches it against past experience, fills the gaps with assumption, and delivers the result to your consciousness as if it were fact. The story feels like perception. It is not. It is construction. Psychologists call this confabulation when it happens in certain neurological conditions. But a version of it is happening in all of us, constantly. The brain's primary job is prediction, generating a model of what's happening and what will happen next, so you can act without having to process everything from scratch every time. Efficiency is the goal. Accuracy is secondary. And in social situations, where the stakes feel personal, the model your brain generates is shaped heavily by your fears, your history, and your existing beliefs about yourself and other people. So if you carry a quiet belief that people eventually lose interest in you, your brain will interpret neutral behavior as early evidence of that loss. If you believe that authority figures are inherently critical, a flat expression from your manager will register as disapproval before a word is spoken. The filter is invisible. The output feels like reality. But you're not seeing the situation. You're seeing your model of the situation. And your model has significant bias built in. Here's the uncomfortable part. And you know this is true the second you hear it. Most of the suffering you've experienced in relationships was not caused by what actually happened. It was caused by the story you told about what happened. The story that felt so obvious, so certain, so clearly justified, that you never thought to question it. The technique that interrupts this is not optimism. Optimism would have you replace the negative story with a positive one. That's not what this is. This is about accuracy. It's about recognizing that your first interpretation of a charged situation is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. And hypotheses require evidence before they're treated as fact. When something triggers you, your brain has already written the story. Your job is to hold that story loosely, to ask, what else could this mean? Not what would make me feel better about it. What are the other plausible explanations for this behavior, given everything I actually know, not everything I fear? Your colleague didn't respond for 3 hours. Alternative explanations, all equally plausible. They were in back-to-back meetings. They saw it and forgot. They're drafting a longer response. They're having a hard day that has nothing to do with you. Any of these could be true. The one your brain chose first was the one that fit the fear. That's not insight. That's pattern matching with a negative bias. Psychologists call the intentional practice of generating alternative explanations cognitive reappraisal. But I want to be clear about what this is not. It's not telling yourself everything is fine. It's not dismissing your instincts. Instincts carry real information. Sometimes the first read is accurate. The practice is simply refusing to let the first read become the only read before you have evidence. There's a physical signal that tells you when you're inside a story rather than perceiving clearly. The story feels urgent. It wants resolution immediately. It is uncomfortable with ambiguity. It pushes you toward action, toward sending the confrontational message, toward making the defensive comment, toward doing something to resolve the tension your brain manufactured. That urgency is not intuition. Intuition is quiet. Urgency is anxiety wearing a costume. When you feel that urgency, that's the signal to slow down. Not because the situation isn't real, but because the story about the situation is almost certainly outrunning the evidence. And acting on a story before you verified it is how you create the very outcomes you were afraid of. Here's something worth building as a habit. After any situation that triggers you, before you respond, write down, even just mentally, what you know for certain happened versus what you've added, the observable facts, then the interpretation. You'll be surprised consistently by how thin the factual layer is and how thick the interpretive layer has grown on top of it. The colleague who snapped at you in the hallway. Fact. Their tone was sharp. Interpretation. They're angry with you specifically. It's about the project. They've been building resentment for weeks. Those are 3 inferences stacked on top of a single sharp tone. And each inference pulled you further from the actual situation and deeper into a story that may have no relationship to what's actually happening inside that person. When you start separating fact from interpretation consistently, something shifts in how you experience other people. They become less threatening. Not because they're better people, but because you're no longer assigning them motivations they may not have. You stop treating your fears about people as information about people, and that distinction creates an entirely different quality of relationship. Less defended, less preemptive, more accurate. The stories your brain writes are not evidence of a damaged mind. They're evidence of a very efficient one. Efficiency optimized for speed, not precision. Your job is to introduce a small delay, a moment of editorial oversight, between the story your brain generates and the response you give it. That moment is where the quality of your relationships lives. That moment is where misunderstandings get caught before they calcify into conflict. That moment is where you stop punishing people for things they never actually did. Most of what you're reacting to isn't happening out there. It's happening in the space between your ears, in the narrative engine that runs faster than thought. You can't turn it off, but you can learn to edit it. And an edited story, slower, more accurate, more generous with ambiguity, will change your life more quietly and more permanently than almost anything else in this book. Chapter 7. Boundaries aren't walls. The people with the loudest boundaries often have the weakest ones. You've seen this. The person who announces their limits in every conversation, who talks constantly about what they will and won't accept, who makes their boundaries everyone else's problem. That person is usually still getting walked on, just with better vocabulary. Real boundaries don't need to be announced. They're built into how you behave, not what you declare. And the difference between a boundary that holds and one that doesn't has almost nothing to do with the other person. It has everything to do with your own internal clarity about what you value, what you'll do when those values are crossed, and whether you're willing to follow through regardless of how the other person responds. Most people think boundaries are about stopping other people from behaving badly. That's the wrong frame. You cannot control what other people do. A boundary isn't a command. It's a decision about yourself. It's not, if you do that again, I'm going to be very upset. That's a threat wearing a boundary's clothing. A real boundary sounds more like, if this continues, here's what I will do. and then you do it. Without drama, without negotiation, without waiting for them to understand. The reason most people's boundaries collapse isn't because they lack conviction when they set them. It's because the boundary was built on the wrong foundation. It was built on the hope that the other person would change. And when they didn't, when they pushed back, got hurt, got angry, or simply ignored the limit, the boundary dissolved because the only thing holding it up was their cooperation. Here's where most boundary conversations go wrong. Someone does something that crosses a line. You feel the violation. And instead of acting from your own values, you act from your reaction. The boundary gets set in an emotional state, tight, urgent, defensive. And emotional boundaries are brittle. They feel powerful in the moment of declaration. They crack under sustained pressure. The boundaries that hold are set in calm. They're decided before the situation occurs. You know, before someone cancels on you for the fourth time, what that pattern means for how you'll invest in that relationship. You know, before your manager asks you to take on extra work without acknowledgement, what your response will be. The decision has already been made. When the moment arrives, you're not reacting. You're executing a prior choice. I've spent years confusing the announcement of a boundary with the actual holding of one. They are not the same thing, not even close. There are 4 types of internal boundaries worth understanding, because each one protects something different. The first is an energy boundary. This is your decision about which emotional weather you'll allow to alter your own internal climate. Someone comes at you furious. You can register their fury accurately, clearly, without absorbing it into your own nervous system. Empathy doesn't require you to feel what they feel. It requires you to understand what they feel. The moment you start feeling their anger as your own, you've lost the energy boundary. You're no longer helping. You're just adding another dysregulated person to the situation. The second is a responsibility boundary. This is the line between what is yours to carry and what belongs to someone else. A staggering amount of emotional exhaustion comes from carrying other people's emotional states as personal obligations. When someone is unhappy, you feel responsible for fixing it. When someone is disappointed, you feel guilty. When someone is angry, you feel like the cause even when you're not. Dropping that misplaced responsibility isn't coldness. It's accuracy. Their emotions are real. They're just not yours to manage. The third is a meaning boundary. This is perhaps the most underrated one. It's your decision about who gets to define what your behavior means. Someone tells you you're selfish. Someone says you're too sensitive, too much, not enough. Someone frames your choices as evidence of your character flaws. A meaning boundary means you receive that input, evaluate it honestly, extract anything genuinely useful, and then decide for yourself what is true. You do not hand other people the pen to write the story of who you are. That pen stays with you. The fourth is an attention boundary. Your attention is finite. Where it goes determines the shape of your inner life. An attention boundary means you decide, deliberately, not reactively, what deserves your mental energy. Not every conflict needs your participation. Not every critical comment needs extended processing. Not every difficult person needs a significant portion of your cognitive bandwidth. You get to choose. Most people have never made that choice consciously. They've just followed their attention wherever provocation pointed it. What makes all 4 of these real rather than theoretical is consistency. A boundary you enforce once and abandon the second time isn't a boundary. It's a suggestion, and people, not maliciously, but naturally, will test what's real. Not because they're trying to undermine you, but because humans calibrate their behavior to what actually has consequences. When you hold the boundary consistently, the testing stops. Not always immediately, but it stops. The discomfort of holding a boundary is temporary. It peaks in the moment when the other person pushes back, when they're hurt or angry or disappointed or try to negotiate. That moment is the test, not the setting of the boundary, the holding of it when it's uncomfortable. And the discomfort you feel in that moment is almost never about them. It's about your fear of their reaction, about the story you're telling about what their disappointment means, about an old pattern where keeping the peace felt safer than keeping your integrity. Boundaries don't make relationships colder. They make them honest. When people know where you actually stand, they stop guessing. When they stop guessing, the low-grade tension that lives in ambiguous relationships starts to lift. And the relationships that remain, the ones built on honest mutual terms, carry a depth and stability that relationships built on managed distance never quite reach. You don't build strong boundaries by becoming harder. You build them by becoming clearer about what matters to you, about what you'll do when it's compromised, and about the fact that your peace is not negotiable, not because you're rigid, but because you finally understood that no relationship improves when you hollow yourself out to maintain it. Chapter 8. The 4 Faces of Difficult. You've tried patience, you've tried directness, you've tried giving more space, and you've tried moving closer. And with this particular person, nothing works. They don't respond the way other difficult people respond. The strategies that usually help seem to either bounce off completely or make things actively worse. You're not failing at conflict resolution. You're using the right tool on the wrong type of problem. Difficult behavior is not monolithic. It comes in distinct patterns, each one driven by a different underlying psychology, each one requiring a different approach. When you treat all difficult people the same way, you'll be right some of the time and completely ineffective the rest. The skill isn't just staying calm in the face of difficult behavior. It's reading the behavior accurately enough to respond to what's actually driving it. Every difficult person is solving a problem. That's the frame that changes everything. Their behavior, however frustrating, however irrational it appears, makes perfect sense to their nervous system. It's the solution their psychology arrived at for managing fear, pain, or unmet need. Find the problem they're solving, and the behavior stops being bewildering. It becomes navigable. The first type is the controller. You know this person. They micromanage. They give advice you didn't ask for. They need to know the plan before they'll engage. And they need the plan to stay exactly as agreed. Deviation, even minor, even clearly beneficial, produces visible stress in them. They frame their controlling behavior as thoroughness, expertise, or care. What it actually is anxiety wearing an authoritative costume. Controllers experienced environments at some point, in childhood, in past relationships, in previous work situations, where unpredictability meant something bad, where losing control of outcomes had real consequences. Their nervous system learned that the only safe state is the managed state. Control became the primary coping mechanism. So when you resist their management, you're not just inconveniencing them. You're activating something that feels existentially threatening to their system. The move with controllers is not to fight for autonomy directly. That triggers their anxiety, which intensifies their controlling behavior. The move is to give them the sense of input and involvement, while you maintain actual decision-making power. You're not deceiving them. You're meeting a real psychological need. Ask their opinion on the aspects where their input is genuinely useful. Offer choices rather than presenting a single plan. Give them a role in the process that's meaningful. Their anxiety decreases when they feel included, and a less anxious controller is a significantly less controlling one. The second type is the approval seeker. This person takes up space, loudly, constantly, creatively. They interrupt. They redirect every conversation back to themselves. They manufacture crises that require your attention and emotional energy. They perform. When they don't receive the attention they're seeking, they escalate. More drama, bigger crisis, louder performance. What's underneath this is a profound fear of being forgotten, of being invisible. At some point, this person learned that quiet presence wasn't enough to guarantee they'd be seen. That dramatic presence was more reliable. The behavior that exhausts you is the behavior that has, historically, worked for them. It got them something. Not the deep connection they actually need, but attention, which their nervous system learned to accept as the closest available substitute. The strategy here is to selectively reinforce. Give genuine, warm attention to their reasonable behavior. Express interest in their actual thoughts and experiences when they're being real rather than performative. And when the drama escalates, when the crisis appears, don't take the bait. Acknowledge briefly. Stay calm. Then redirect your attention. You're not punishing them. You're just refusing to reinforce the pattern that keeps them stuck. The third type is the critic. This person finds the flaw in the plan, in the execution, in your approach, in your reasoning. Sometimes the criticism is disguised as helpfulness. Sometimes it isn't disguised at all. Either way, the effect is the same: a low-level erosion of confidence and enthusiasm in everyone around them. Praise is rare. Approval is rationed. The standard is always slightly beyond what's achievable. Critics are almost always hardest on themselves. The internal critic that runs their internal life is severe and unrelenting. What they project outward is a more socially acceptable version of what they do to themselves constantly. Their perfectionism isn't about high standards for its own sake. It's about fear, specifically, fear that if something isn't scrutinized thoroughly, something bad will slip through. Criticism is how they feel safe. With critics, resistance and defense are counterproductive. The moment you defend your work, you've entered their frame. You're now debating the validity of the criticism instead of directing the conversation. The more effective move is to receive the criticism without contracting, to ask genuinely clarifying questions that move the focus from problem to solution. What specifically would improvement look like? What result are you hoping for? You're not conceding that the criticism is valid. You're demonstrating enough security to engage with it without becoming defensive. That security, paradoxically, often disarms the critic faster than any argument. The fourth type is the chronic victim. This person is always in difficulty. The situations change. The position doesn't. They are always the one who has been wronged, overlooked, underestimated, mistreated. They collect evidence of this with something that looks almost like dedication. And when you try to help, when you offer solutions, perspectives, practical options, they explain, patiently or impatiently, why each one won't work. The chronic victim is not consciously manipulative. They are genuinely suffering, but their suffering has become an identity. And an identity is the hardest thing to give up because it structures everything. Being the victim means never having to risk failure, because failure was always someone else's fault. It means guaranteed sympathy. It means a permanent explanation for why life hasn't gone the way it should. The error most people make with chronic victims is trying to rescue them, offering solutions, taking on their problems. This feels helpful. It isn't. It confirms their belief that they're incapable of solving their own problems. The more effective approach is to listen with genuine compassion, briefly, and then ask questions that point toward their own agency. What options do you see? What would need to change? What's one thing you could do? Even a small one. You're not abandoning them. You're refusing to confirm the story that they're powerless. That refusal, offered with warmth and consistency, is the most genuinely helpful thing you can do. Understanding these 4 patterns doesn't mean you'll always get it right. People are combinations, and behavior shifts under pressure. But having the map means you're no longer navigating blind. You're responding to what's actually happening, to the fear underneath the control, the loneliness underneath the performance, the anxiety underneath the criticism, the helplessness underneath the complaint. And responding to what's real, rather than reacting to what's surface, is where difficult people stop being obstacles and start being entirely manageable. Chapter 9. How to respond when someone swings at you. Someone says something designed to sting. You feel it land, and for a half-second you experience a very specific internal pull. The pull toward the sharp comeback, the correction, the escalation. That pull feels like self-respect. It is not. It's the activation looking for an exit. The pull toward immediate retaliation is one of the oldest and most expensive instincts you have. It feels like standing up for yourself. But standing up for yourself and reacting from injury are not the same thing. One comes from strength and clarity. The other comes from a wound that's been touched. And responses that come from wounds almost never land the way you intended, because they're not actually aimed at the situation. They're aimed at the pain. Here's what's actually happening when someone attacks you verbally. They're running a script. The script has 2 or 3 expected responses built into it. Defend yourself, counterattack, or collapse. Those are the options their system has prepared for. They know, consciously or not, how to handle each of those responses. They've already got the next move. What they don't have a move for is the response that doesn't fit the script at all. The non-reactive response isn't silence. It isn't submission. It isn't the performance of calm while you're boiling internally. It's a genuine redirection, away from the adversarial frame the other person has established, and into a different kind of conversation entirely. One they weren't prepared for. And that unpreparedness creates a pause in their pattern that changes the entire dynamic. The first type of non-reactive response is genuine curiosity, not performed curiosity, not the kind of careful, slow questioning that's obviously designed to make them feel foolish. Real curiosity about what's underneath what they just said. That's interesting. Help me understand what specifically is driving that. Or, it sounds like there's something here that matters a lot to you. What is it? This works because almost every verbal attack is a failed bid for something. Understanding, recognition, respect, control. When you respond to the attack, you're engaging with the failure. When you respond with curiosity, you're reaching toward the underlying bid. And most people, even the most hostile ones, are not prepared for someone to take their pain seriously instead of fighting back against their armor. The key is that your curiosity has to be real. If you're asking questions while internally building your counterargument, they'll feel it. People are extraordinarily sensitive to whether they're being genuinely engaged with or skillfully managed. Real curiosity requires temporarily suspending your own position, not abandoning it, but setting it aside long enough to actually understand theirs. That temporary suspension is not weakness. It's the most sophisticated form of confidence. Only someone who is genuinely secure can do it. The second type is emotional validation without content agreement. This distinction is precise and important. You are not agreeing with what they said. You are acknowledging that they feel strongly about it. It sounds like you're really frustrated, or I can see this has been bothering you for a while. You're meeting the emotion underneath the words, not the words themselves. This disarms attacks, because most attacks are driven by the need to be heard. When someone feels genuinely heard, not agreed with, but heard, the physiological urgency behind their aggression starts to decrease. The attack wasn't about winning the argument. It was about making the pain real to someone else. When you validate the pain without engaging the attack, you address the actual need without getting pulled into the adversarial frame. The third type is strategic agreement. Find something in what they said that you can honestly agree with, even partially, and agree with it without qualification. If someone says you never follow through, and there's any truth in that at all, you might say, "You're right that I've dropped the ball on some things recently. That's fair. And I want to understand what's been most frustrating for you." You're not accepting the totality of the accusation. You're acknowledging the kernel of truth without defending against the exaggeration. This move requires real security. It's nearly impossible to do from a triggered state. Here's something that took me a long time to accept. Agreeing with a partial truth doesn't make the whole accusation true. Defensiveness is not the same as accuracy. You can concede a point and still hold your ground on the broader picture. The fourth type is what I'd call the redirect to outcome. You acknowledge their communication briefly, and then you steer toward what would actually be useful. I hear that you're not happy with how this is going. What would a better outcome look like to you? This moves the conversation from the past, where attacks live, into the future, where solutions live. People who are committed to conflict will resist this move, but most people, given a genuine invitation to describe what they actually want, will accept it. Because what they actually want is usually not the argument. It's the result the argument was supposed to produce. The fifth type is transparent vulnerability. This is the hardest one, and it's the most powerful. When someone attacks and you respond by honestly naming your own experience, not as a weapon, not as a performance, but as a real disclosure, the dynamic shifts almost immediately. I have to be honest, that hurt to hear. I'm not saying it's wrong. I want to understand it. But it landed hard. This response requires courage that most people don't access when they're triggered. Because when we're triggered, the last thing we want to do is show that we were affected. But showing it cleanly, without drama, is not weakness. It's the kind of honesty that makes aggression feel suddenly disproportionate to the person deploying it. None of these responses guarantee that the other person will become reasonable. Some people are committed to conflict in a way that no response can fully redirect. With those people, strategic disengagement is its own form of non-reactivity. You're not running. You're declining to participate. I want to give this conversation the attention it deserves. Let me come back to it when we can both engage with it well. That's a statement of intention, not retreat, and it keeps your dignity intact without requiring the other person to cooperate. What all of these responses have in common is that they come from a chosen place rather than a triggered one. They require the pause, the breath, the beat, the half-second between activation and action. Without that pause, none of this is accessible. With it, you have a full range of responses available that the person attacking you has no script for. And in that scriptlessness, the power dynamic quietly shifts. You become the most composed person in the exchange. And composed, in almost every situation, wins. Chapter 10. Who you become when you stop reacting. People aren't drawn to confidence. Not really. What they're drawn to is the person who doesn't need anything from the room. The person who walks in without an agenda for how others should perceive them. Who speaks without scanning for approval. Who listens without calculating their next move. That quality, that particular kind of self-containment, is rarer than intelligence, rarer than charisma, and more magnetic than either. You've felt it in someone. Maybe a mentor, maybe a stranger at a dinner party. Maybe someone you worked with briefly who you still think about years later. There was something about them that made the air in the room feel different, steadier, like they were operating at a different frequency than everyone else. What you were sensing wasn't superiority. It was the absence of reactivity. And that absence created a gravitational pull that drew people in without any visible effort on their part. This is what emotional mastery actually produces in the social world. Not just internal peace, though it produces that too. It produces a restructuring of who wants to be near you, who seeks your input, who trusts your judgment, and who quietly, almost imperceptibly, begins to orient toward you when things get hard. That restructuring is not something you engineer. It happens as a natural consequence of the kind of person you're becoming. And understanding how it works will change what you're actually working toward. Start with the most immediate effect. When you stop reacting to provocation, you become unpredictable in the most useful way possible. Difficult people, manipulators, controllers, chronic provocateurs, depend on predictable reactions. Their strategies only work if you respond according to script. The moment your responses stop being automatic, their toolkit becomes useless. They push the button that used to produce the reaction. Nothing happens. They push it again. Still nothing. And in that absence, their power over you evaporates. Not because you fought them, but because you stopped cooperating with the mechanism. This is not a subtle shift. People who previously enjoyed getting a rise out of you will either change how they interact with you or quietly drift away. Both outcomes serve you. The ones who drift away were only there for the reaction. The ones who stay, who adjust, who become more honest and less performative with you, those relationships develop into something with actual substance. Your emotional regulation has functioned as a filter. Without you doing anything except remaining steady, your social environment has begun to self-sort. The deeper effect happens in high-stakes group situations. Think about the last time you were in a room where tension was rising, a difficult meeting, a family gathering going sideways, a team in the middle of a genuine crisis. In those moments, there's always someone who makes things worse, who adds their emotion to the pile, who escalates rather than steadies, who speaks from their activation rather than their judgment. And there's occasionally someone who does the opposite. who doesn't try to dominate the room or fix the problem immediately, who just stays calm, who listens, who asks the question that reframes the situation without forcing an outcome. That second person becomes the center of gravity in the room, not because they're loudest or most senior or most strategically positioned, because they're the most regulated. People in distress instinctively orient toward the most stable presence available. It's not a decision they make consciously. It's a nervous system response. Regulation is contagious in both directions. Panic spreads, and so does calm. The calmest person in the room sets the emotional floor for everyone else. That person can be you. This influence, quiet, structural, not announced, is a fundamentally different kind of power than most people pursue. Most people pursue power by trying to be the most impressive, the most assertive, the most right. That kind of power requires constant maintenance. It's exhausting and fragile. The power that comes from emotional mastery requires no maintenance because it's not a performance. It's a condition. It doesn't depend on the room going well. It holds even when the room is falling apart. Especially then. Look, the social recalibration that comes with emotional mastery isn't all comfortable. Some people will misread your calm as indifference. Some will test it, consciously or not, to see if it's real or performed. Some will feel unsettled by it because your steadiness highlights their own reactivity. You're not responsible for managing those responses, but you should expect them. The transition from reactive to regulated is not socially frictionless. People who knew the old version of you will sometimes prefer it, because the old version was more manageable, more predictable, more willing to be pulled into the current. What you're building is not a persona. That's important. A persona of calm, someone who performs serenity while suppressing a churning interior, is exhausting to maintain and eventually cracks. What you're building is a genuine shift in your baseline state. The difference shows in the details. A performed calm is careful. It monitors itself. It hesitates before speaking. It has a quality of watchfulness that perceptive people notice. A genuine calm is easy. It doesn't monitor itself because it doesn't need to. It speaks simply. It's comfortable with silence. It has no angle. Building toward that genuine baseline requires something that's easy to overlook. You have to get honest about the social payoffs of reactivity, because there are some. When you react strongly, you signal that you care. People know where they stand with you. Your emotions make you legible. There's intimacy in that legibility, even when the emotion is anger. When you become less reactive, you lose some of that legibility. And some people will experience that as distance, even when you're more genuinely present than you've ever been. This is one of the less discussed costs of emotional development. The relationships that were built on shared reactivity, on venting together, on mutual outrage, on the bond of feeling wronged by the same things, those relationships sometimes don't survive the transition. Not because anything went wrong, but because the basis of the connection was the reactivity itself, not the people. When you change, the architecture of those relationships changes. Some will adapt, some won't. And you'll need to let both outcomes be acceptable. What grows in place of those relationships is worth the loss. When you're not reactive, people trust you with things they don't tell reactive people. They know you won't escalate, won't judge harshly, won't turn their disclosure into drama. You become a safe place to think out loud, and the depth of access that creates, the quality of conversation, The level of honesty, the texture of genuine connection, is incomparable to anything that reactive relationships produce. Your emotional mastery also models something for everyone watching, and more people are watching than you realize. The junior colleague who sees you handle an unfair criticism with grace. The child who watches you respond to frustration without exploding. The friend who observes you set a boundary without cruelty. These people are taking notes, not consciously, but in the way humans always learn the things that matter most. By watching someone do it. By seeing that it's possible. By understanding at a level below language that there's another way. You become, without trying to, a proof of concept. Proof that a person can be fully present in difficulty without being consumed by it. Proof that strength doesn't require aggression. Proof that the most powerful response is sometimes the quietest one. That proof matters far beyond your own life. It ripples outward in ways you'll never fully track. The version of you that exists on the other side of genuine emotional mastery is not a calmer version of who you are now. It's a more fully realized version. More of your actual intelligence becomes available because less of it is occupied by managing threats. More of your creativity surfaces because the internal weather is stable enough to support it. More of your warmth is accessible because you're not spending it on defense. Here's the final thing about who you become when you stop reacting. You stop being at the mercy of other people's worst days. Right now, someone else's bad morning can derail your afternoon. Someone else's insecurity can determine whether you feel confident or diminished today. Someone else's emotional chaos can set the temperature of your entire inner life for hours. That's an enormous amount of power to be living under. And it's power you've been handing over, mostly without noticing. When you reclaim it, not through resistance, not through emotional shutdown, but through genuine internal stability, what you get back is not just peace. You get back your own life. Your attention becomes yours again. Your reactions become choices. Your emotional state becomes something you largely determine rather than something that's largely determined for you. And the person living that life, present, deliberate, genuinely free, is almost unrecognizable to the person who used to lie awake replaying arguments with people who were already asleep. That's not a small change. That's everything. Chapter 11. The Daily Architecture of Calm. You're already irritable before the first difficult thing happens. Not because you're a reactive person, because of what you did and didn't do in the first 20 minutes after you woke up. You checked your phone before your nervous system had fully calibrated to consciousness. You scrolled through other people's urgencies, other people's outrage, other people's highlight reels, before you'd established a single thought of your own. And by the time you were in the shower, you were already behind. Already responding to a world that hadn't given you a second to orient yourself within it. This is not a morning routine problem. It's an architecture problem. Most people build their days reactively, responding to whatever arrives first, loudest, or most insistently. And then they wonder why they feel scattered, depleted, and on edge by midday. They think the difficult colleague caused the irritability. They don't see that the irritability was already there, built into the structure of the day before the colleague showed up. Emotional regulation is not primarily a skill you deploy in hard moments. It's an infrastructure you build in quiet ones. The moments of genuine crisis, the triggered conversations, the unexpected attacks, the situations where everything you've learned gets tested. Those moments are the performance. And performance is always determined by preparation. What happens at 3 p.m. when someone challenges you in a meeting is largely determined by what happened between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. Most people have never made that connection. The morning is the most leveraged hour you have, not because of productivity, though that follows, but because the nervous system is most impressionable in the first hour after waking. The emotional tone you establish in that window tends to persist. Not absolutely, but measurably. If the first hour is reactive, flooded with information, decisions, and other people's emotional content, the baseline for the whole day is set slightly higher. You're already at a 4 before anything has happened. Then the difficult thing happens, and you're at a 7 before you know it. The gap from 4 to 7 is much shorter than the gap from 1 to 7. The morning determined which gap you were working with. What the first hour should contain is simple, not elaborate, not a 2-hour wellness production. Simple, consistent, and physical. 5 minutes of breathing before you look at a screen. Not meditation as a performance of spirituality, just deliberate breath. In for 4 counts, out for 6. Long enough to move your nervous system from the light sympathetic activation of waking into a more settled parasympathetic state. That's all. 5 minutes of breath before the world starts talking at you. Then movement. Not necessarily exercise, though exercise is its own category of essential. Just movement. A walk, some stretching. Anything that gets you out of the contracted physical state that sleep and screen staring both produce. Your emotional state lives in your body before it lives in your mind. Moving the body changes the emotional state directly, without requiring any cognitive effort at all. This is why people who exercise regularly are measurably more emotionally regulated, not because they've made better choices, but because they've given their nervous system a daily reset that most people skip. Then, before email, before news, before any content that represents someone else's agenda, a few minutes of setting your own. Not a task list, an intention. How do you want to show up today? In the meeting that might get tense, how do you want to respond? With the person who tends to trigger you, what version of yourself do you want to bring? Spend 2 minutes with those questions. Visualize the scenarios specifically. See yourself pausing before responding. Feel the steadiness in your chest. This is not magical thinking. It's neurological preparation. The brain that has rehearsed a response is measurably more likely to produce it under pressure than the brain that hasn't. These 3 things, breath, movement, intention, take 20 minutes combined. They are not glamorous. They will not be featured in anyone's aspirational morning content. But they shift the baseline more reliably than any sophisticated intervention deployed after the fact. The middle of the day has its own architecture, and the most important structural element is the transition. Most people move from one high-demand situation to the next without any buffer. Meeting to meeting, conversation to conversation, task to task. The emotional residue of each one gets carried into the next. By the end of the day, you're not just responding to the last situation, you're responding to the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. Build transitions into your day. They don't need to be long. 2 minutes between a difficult meeting and the next thing. Step outside. Breathe. Shake out your hands if you need to. Do something physical that signals to your nervous system that the previous context is closed. You are not carrying it forward. This sounds trivial. It is not. The cumulative effect of those 2-minute transitions over the course of a day is a nervous system that arrives at 5 p.m. significantly less depleted than it would otherwise be. And a less depleted nervous system makes better decisions, handles friction better, and recovers faster from the things that do land. Midday is also when your glucose and cortisol patterns create a natural vulnerability window. Most people feel it as a vague irritability or flatness around early afternoon. They interpret it as boredom or laziness. It's often physiological. Blood sugar is lower, the morning's cortisol peak has passed, and the afternoon's hasn't arrived. This is not the time for difficult conversations. Schedule them earlier when your resources are highest. Protect the vulnerable window with movement, food, or a genuine break rather than pushing through it on willpower. Willpower is a finite resource. Protecting it by working with your biology instead of against it is not laziness. It's strategy. The evening has perhaps the most underestimated architectural impact. What you do in the 2 hours before sleep determines the quality of the sleep itself, and sleep is the primary mechanism by which emotional regulation is restored neurologically. The prefrontal cortex literally rebuilds its capacity during deep sleep. People who are chronically sleep-deprived are chronically more reactive, not because of their psychology, but because of their neurology. You cannot build emotional resilience on insufficient sleep. The architecture of calm starts there, which means that what goes into your mind in the 2 hours before bed matters enormously. The news, the social media scroll, the emotionally stimulating content, all of it activates the nervous system in ways that delay sleep onset and reduce sleep quality. This is not a minor inconvenience. It's a direct tax on your emotional regulation capacity for the entire following day. Replace the late-night scroll with something that winds the nervous system down rather than winding it up. Light reading? Gentle movement? Conversation with someone you love? A brief journal practice, not processing every emotion of the day, just a few minutes of release. What happened? What you noticed? What you'd do differently? What you're grateful for, specifically, not in a performative way, but as a genuine scan for what was good. That scan rewires the brain's negativity bias slowly, over time, toward a more balanced and accurate assessment of daily experience. The journal practice deserves particular attention because it does something that no other daily practice accomplishes. It creates a record of your patterns. Over weeks and months, you start to see things that are invisible day to day. The triggers that recur in the same type of situation. The time of day when your regulation is most compromised. The specific people or interaction types that cost you the most energy. With that data, your own data, from your own life, you can make structural changes rather than just coping after the fact. You can anticipate rather than react. You can redesign rather than endure. Here's the thing about building this architecture. It doesn't feel transformative while you're doing it. That's the nature of infrastructure. You don't feel a bridge being built. You feel the difference when you need to cross the river. The daily practices of breath, movement, intention, transition, sleep, and reflection are all invisible in their individual moments. Their effect is cumulative and quiet and profound. And one day, not dramatically, not all at once, you'll find yourself in a situation that would have derailed you completely 6 months ago, and you'll handle it. Not perfectly, but solidly. From a place that feels genuinely like yours, and you'll understand, in that moment, that the architecture held. Chapter 12. Criticism, Rejection, and the Verdict. You never agreed to the criticism that stings most is rarely the most accurate. It's the one that lands on something you already suspect about yourself. That's the mechanism. The comment your colleague made about your presentation didn't hurt because they were right. It hurt because some part of you wasn't sure they were wrong. And that uncertainty, that existing crack in your self-assessment, is what the criticism found. Like water finding a fracture in stone. The crack was already there. The criticism just revealed it. This is why people with genuinely high self-esteem don't sting the same way under criticism as people who are performing confidence. The performance of confidence is brittle. It needs to be defended because it's not structurally sound. Real self-regard is different. It doesn't need defense because it's not threatened by information. It can hold a critical opinion, examine it, extract what's useful, discard what isn't, without the whole edifice shaking. Most people have never examined the implicit agreement they've made with other people's opinions. But there is one. An agreement that says, if enough people think something about me, or if the right person thinks something about me, that thing becomes true. That agreement was never conscious. It was absorbed gradually, from early experiences in which other people's assessments had real consequences. When a parent's disappointment meant something concrete. When a teacher's criticism changed your status in the classroom. When rejection from the group wasn't just painful, it was genuinely costly. Your brain learned in those early environments that other people's opinions about you are data you cannot afford to ignore. And it was right in those environments. The problem is that the learning never updated. The same urgency you felt at 8 years old when a peer group rejected you is the same urgency your nervous system generates when a client criticizes your proposal at 34. The stakes are completely different. The physiological response is nearly identical. Your brain hasn't distinguished between the childhood verdict that had real consequences and the adult criticism that, in reality, you have complete freedom to evaluate and partially or entirely dismiss. Understanding this doesn't automatically dissolve the sting, but it changes your relationship to it. The sting is neurological. It's the old alarm system doing its job. It is not evidence that the criticism is correct. It is not evidence that your worth has been accurately assessed. It is evidence that your nervous system is working exactly as it was designed, in an era that no longer applies. Here is the sorting process that changes everything. When criticism lands, before you react, before you defend, before you dismiss, before you collapse, run it through 3 questions. First, does this person have relevant knowledge or experience that makes their assessment worth weighing? A criticism from your most skilled colleague about a technical decision carries different weight than the same criticism from someone who doesn't understand the domain. Both deserve basic courtesy. Only one deserves significant cognitive real estate. Second, is this person's criticism specific and actionable, or is it vague and global? Specific criticism, your argument in Section 3 lacks supporting data, is useful regardless of how it's delivered. Global criticism, you just don't think rigorously enough, tells you more about the critic's emotional state than about your actual work. Specific criticism is feedback. Global criticism is projection wearing feedback's clothes. You can receive the first as information. The second you can acknowledge briefly and largely release. Third, is there a kernel of truth here, even if the delivery is completely wrong? This is the hardest question, because when someone has delivered criticism cruelly or unfairly, the desire to find any truth in it feels like capitulation. It is not. Extracting something real from a poorly delivered criticism is a skill. It's separating the message from the messenger, and it requires enough security that you don't need to defend against the whole thing just because the packaging was hostile. This sorting process takes seconds once you've practiced it, and it permanently changes your relationship to being criticized because you're no longer at the mercy of the delivery. Harsh delivery no longer automatically invalidates the content, and gentle delivery no longer automatically validates it. You've become the evaluator rather than the recipient. That shift is the difference between criticism controlling your emotional state and criticism informing your development. Rejection operates on a different mechanism than criticism, but it's even more deeply wired. Rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. This is not metaphor. Brain imaging studies show that social rejection and physical injury produce overlapping patterns of activation in the brain. Your brain does not distinguish clearly between being told no and being hit. Both register as damage. This is why rejection can feel physically painful, because to the brain's older systems, it nearly is. For most of human evolutionary history, rejection from the social group was genuinely life-threatening. Exclusion meant loss of protection, resources, and reproductive access. The individuals whose brains treated social rejection as an emergency were more motivated to avoid it, and therefore more likely to survive. You are the descendant of those people. The alarm that fires when you're rejected is ancient, deep, and calibrated for a world where rejection carried mortal consequences. That world no longer exists, but the alarm hasn't been updated. So when the publisher rejects your manuscript, when the person doesn't call back, when the job offer doesn't come, when the pitch gets passed over, your nervous system registers it in the same register as a genuine threat to your survival. The response is physiologically real. The interpretation that this rejection means something permanent and definitive about your value is a story that your activated brain is generating, not a fact being delivered from outside. Rejection is data about fit. That's the reframe that actually holds up under pressure. Not because it makes rejection painless, it doesn't, but because it's accurate in a way that the self-referential interpretation isn't. When someone passes on your work, they're communicating something about their needs, their timing, their capacity, their existing commitments, their aesthetic preferences. They are not delivering a verdict on your fundamental worth. They don't have access to that information. Nobody does, except you. And the verdict they are delivering, "This doesn't work for me right now," is almost never the same verdict your brain translates it into. You are not good enough and probably never will be. The translation is the problem, not the rejection itself. And the translation is happening automatically, in the same 12-millisecond window where all your other emotional interpretations are constructed. Your job is to catch the translation and revise it toward accuracy. What they actually communicated, not what your ancient alarm system decided it meant. Building what researchers call rejection resilience requires one counterintuitive practice above all others. You have to increase your exposure to rejection rather than decreasing it. Not recklessly, not in ways that damage what matters to you, but deliberately seeking out the small rejections, the low-stakes no's, the minor dismissals that sting briefly but don't devastate. Ask for the upgrade you're unlikely to get. Submit to the publication that rarely accepts. Pitch the idea you're not sure will land. Not because these specific outcomes matter deeply, but because each experience of rejection and survival thickens the neural insulation around the alarm. Your brain updates its model. This happened. I felt it. I continued. It was survivable. That update is the definition of resilience. Not the absence of pain, the demonstrated capacity to move through pain and continue. Each time you do it, the next rejection is slightly less catastrophic. Not because you've stopped caring, because you've accumulated evidence that caring and surviving are compatible. That you can want something, not get it, feel the loss genuinely, and still be fully intact on the other side. The final piece, the one that makes all of this sustainable rather than just manageable, is developing what you might call an internal authority. A voice inside you that holds your assessment of your own work, your own worth, your own direction, in a way that doesn't require external confirmation to stay stable. Not arrogance. Arrogance is actually a form of extreme dependence on external opinion. It needs to be superior to everyone else's view to feel secure. Internal authority is quieter. It simply knows what it knows. It can hold a critical opinion without being defined by it. It can absorb a rejection without being sentenced by it. It can fail publicly and clearly and still know what it's worth trying again. That authority is not given to you. It's built. Through the experiences of surviving criticism and continuing, through the practice of evaluating feedback rather than automatically accepting or rejecting it, through the repeated choice to take your own assessment seriously rather than handing that responsibility to whoever happens to have an opinion that day. When you have it, criticism becomes information, rejection becomes data, and other people's verdicts, however loudly delivered, however widely agreed upon, become just one more input in a process where you, finally, are the one making the call. Chapter 13. Advanced Mental Models for Emotional Invincibility. The gap between people who occasionally manage their emotions well and people who are consistently unshakable isn't technique. It's architecture. The way they've built their internal world, the frameworks they use to interpret what happens to them, makes certain emotional responses nearly impossible. Not because they suppress them, because the structure doesn't generate them in the first place. A mental model is a lens, and most people are walking around with lenses they inherited from their families, their early environments, their wounds, without ever choosing them deliberately. Those inherited lenses determine what feels threatening, what feels personal, what feels like evidence of their inadequacy. And since the lens is invisible, the conclusions it generates feel like reality. They feel like perception. They are interpretation. And interpretation can be changed. The first model is one that reframes your entire relationship with difficulty. Consider that everything hard that happens to you is happening for a specific purpose. Not cosmically, not as spiritual reward, but functionally. Difficulty is the mechanism by which psychological capacity is built. Your muscles don't develop in rest. They develop under load. The load is not the enemy of the muscle. It is the condition for its existence. Every challenging person, every triggering situation, every painful rejection is load. It is the condition for the development of capacities you cannot build any other way. Patience that has never been tested is not patience. It's just an untested assumption about yourself. When you internalize this model, genuinely, not as a platitude, the emotional relationship with difficulty transforms. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this building in me?" The question isn't passive or resigned. It's precise. It directs your attention toward what's actually being developed rather than what's being taken. And that directed attention changes what the experience produces in you. The second model is what I'd call the scientist frame. You are a researcher studying human behavior. Every interaction is data. Difficult people are not sources of suffering. They are fascinating case studies in how psychological unmet needs express themselves socially. When your colleague undermines you in a meeting, the scientist doesn't take it personally. The scientist notices. Interesting. When their contribution wasn't acknowledged first, the undermining behavior appeared. What does that tell me about the need driving this pattern? This frame creates immediate emotional distance without requiring suppression. You're not pretending the behavior doesn't affect you. You're genuinely more interested in understanding it than in being hurt by it. And that genuine interest, that intellectual curiosity about human psychology, is one of the most effective emotional regulators available. You cannot be simultaneously curious and hijacked. The two states are neurologically incompatible. The third model is emotional economics. Every emotional reaction has a cost. Not morally, there's no judgment here. Purely economically, getting angry costs you clarity, physical energy, relationship capital, and often time in the form of regret and repair. Staying regulated costs you the momentary satisfaction of the reactive response. Those are the two prices. You're paying one of them regardless. The question is which one you're choosing to pay. When you start tracking this honestly, not as self-criticism, but as genuine accounting, you begin making different choices. Not because you've become more virtuous, because you've become more accurate about what things actually cost. The emotional reaction that felt like justice in the moment cost 3 hours of rumination, a sleep-disrupted night, and a conversation you'll need to have to repair what you said. The regulated response that felt like restraint cost you approximately 45 seconds of discomfort. The accounting is usually not close. The fourth model shifts how you understand other people's behavior at a foundational level. Everyone is operating from their current level of psychological development, not as an excuse for behavior. Behavior still has consequences regardless of its origins, but as an accurate description of what's actually happening. The person who attacks you is not freely choosing malice from a menu of options. They're doing the most sophisticated thing their current emotional development makes available to them. Their cruelty, or their manipulation, or their defensiveness. These are the best tools they currently have. They are not holding out on you. This is genuinely what they've got. That recognition produces something unexpected. Not sympathy that compromises your boundaries. Clarity that removes the personal sting. You stop being the target of their behavior and start being the nearest available surface for it. And surfaces don't take things personally. They simply redirect. The fifth model, and this one is quietly the most powerful, is the authorship frame. You are the author of your own story, not the character in someone else's. Most people live as characters, reactive, defined by what other people do to them, waiting to see how the plot develops before deciding how to feel. Authors operate differently. They hold the pen. They decide what events mean. They determine the arc. They are not indifferent to what happens. Authors care deeply about their stories, but they maintain the perspective of the one telling the story, not the one being told by it. When someone criticizes you harshly, the character responds to the criticism. The author notices it, considers it, decides what role it plays in the larger narrative, and continues writing. When someone rejects you, the character experiences rejection as a verdict. The author files it as a plot development and keeps moving. The authorship model doesn't remove emotion from the experience. It restores the perspective that emotion temporarily displaces. And perspective, that slight elevation above the immediate moment, is the thing that makes choice possible. What all 5 of these models share is that they place you in an active relationship with your experience rather than a passive one. You're not waiting to see how things make you feel. You're deciding, at a structural level, what relationship you have with what happens to you. That decision, made in advance, embedded in the architecture of how you think, is what emotional invincibility actually looks like. Not the absence of activation, the presence of a framework that processes activation differently, faster, more accurately, with less residue. Build the frameworks deliberately. Return to them when you notice the old lenses sliding back into place, because they will. Old interpretive structures are durable. They've been reinforced for years. The new ones need conscious repetition before they become automatic. But they do become automatic. And the person operating from these frameworks, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, is already living in a fundamentally different emotional world than the person who never chose their lens at all. Chapter 14. Building systems that protect your peace automatically. True emotional freedom doesn't come from trying harder in difficult moments. It comes from building a life where fewer difficult moments reach you at full force. Because the architecture of your daily environment has already absorbed most of the impact. Think about that for a moment. Right now, you are managing stress reactively. Something difficult happens. You deploy whatever regulation tools you have available, you recover, and then you wait for the next thing. That's not a system. That's firefighting. And firefighting, however skilled, always leaves you slightly behind. Always responding rather than preventing. Always recovering rather than thriving. The most emotionally resilient people aren't just better at managing stress. They've designed their environments, relationships, information diet, and daily structures to generate significantly less unnecessary stress in the first place. They don't just cope better, they're exposed less. And the combination of better coping capacity and reduced exposure is what produces the kind of sustained equanimity that looks, from the outside, like an unusually calm personality. It isn't personality, it's architecture. Your physical environment is the most underestimated variable in your emotional life. Not because tidiness is a virtue, but because visual and auditory clutter creates background cognitive load that runs continuously without your awareness. A chronically disorganized space keeps your nervous system in a low-level state of incompletion. There are things unresolved, things unfinished, things demanding attention everywhere you look. That background noise raises your baseline stress level before anyone has said a word to you. Reducing it doesn't require perfection. It requires intentionality. One space in your environment that is consistently ordered, calm, and yours. That space becomes a physical anchor for a regulated nervous system. Sound matters more than people realize. Ambient noise at certain frequencies and volumes maintains sympathetic nervous system activation, even when you're not consciously aware of it. The open office, the loud apartment, the constant notifications. Each one is a small tax on your regulation capacity. When you can control sound, control it deliberately. When you can't, invest in what changes the sound environment you carry with you. The return on that investment, measured in emotional regulation capacity, is disproportionate to its cost. Your information diet is the second system to redesign. And this one requires genuine honesty about what you're currently consuming and why. Most people's information consumption is not chosen, it's defaulted into. The phone is picked up because it's there. The news is on because it's habit. The social media scroll happens because stopping requires more friction than continuing. The content that results from this default consumption is, on average, heavily weighted toward outrage, urgency, and negativity, because those states drive engagement, and engagement is what the platforms are optimized for. You are not being informed by this content. You are being activated by it, chronically, without proportionate benefit. The things you're worried about after 45 minutes of news consumption are almost entirely things you have no ability to affect. The activation is real. The agency is absent. That combination, being wound up about things you can't influence, is one of the most efficient routes to chronic low-grade anxiety available in modern life. Redesigning your information diet doesn't mean ignorance. It means intentionality. Specific times for news consumption, not continuous exposure. Curated sources chosen for accuracy and considered analysis rather than emotional urgency. Social feeds adjusted to reflect the content you've actively chosen rather than the content the algorithm has determined will keep you scrolling. These are small changes. Their cumulative effect on your baseline emotional state is not small. The third system is your social environment, who you spend time with and in what structure. This is the most sensitive area because it involves real people and real relationships. But it's also the most impactful because your nervous system is in constant conversation with the nervous systems of the people around you. Regulation is contagious. So is dysregulation. The people you spend significant time with are continuously influencing your emotional baseline in both directions. This doesn't mean cutting everyone difficult out of your life. That's neither possible nor the point. It means being deliberate about proportion. The person who consistently drains your regulation capacity deserves a smaller proportion of your available time than the person who reliably restores it. Not because you've judged them, because you've done the accounting honestly. Energy is finite. Where it goes determines what gets built. Investing more of it in relationships that support your development and less in relationships that destabilize it is not cold. It's strategic in service of becoming more genuinely available to everyone. The fourth system is what I'd call a recovery protocol, not a crisis intervention, a scheduled, non-negotiable restoration practice that runs after significant emotional expenditure regardless of how you feel in the moment. Physical exercise at a level that genuinely elevates heart rate. Time in natural environments, even briefly. Creative engagement that has no audience and no performance. Deep sleep, protected by the pre-sleep practices described earlier. These are not luxuries, they are maintenance. The emotional regulation system, like any complex system, degrades without regular maintenance. And degraded regulation capacity is what turns manageable situations into disproportionate reactions. The fifth system is financial and practical autonomy. This one rarely appears in discussions of emotional regulation. It belongs here. Dependence, financial, practical, logistical, creates vulnerability to emotional manipulation that no amount of psychological skill fully compensates for. When you cannot afford to leave a situation, your ability to maintain boundaries within it is structurally compromised. When you need someone's help to manage basic aspects of your life, your ability to respond to their behavior from a place of genuine choice is limited. Building autonomy, financial reserves, practical competencies, independent resources, is not about self-sufficiency as an ideology. It's about ensuring that your responses to other people are genuinely chosen rather than coerced by circumstance. The person who stays in a damaging situation because they have no alternative is not failing at emotional regulation. They're in a structural problem that psychological skill alone cannot solve. Address the structure. These systems don't produce their results immediately. They produce them gradually, compoundingly, in the background of your daily life. You won't notice the day your morning practice first shifts your baseline. You won't track the specific week your curated information diet reduces your ambient anxiety. But 6 months from now, in a situation that would have completely unraveled the person you were, you'll find yourself steady, responsive, genuinely okay. And you'll understand that the steadiness wasn't summoned in the moment. It was built into the walls of your life long before that moment arrived. Chapter 15. The person standing in the quiet. It's late. The room is dark. The house is quiet. And this time, maybe for the first time, you're not replaying the argument. You're not rehearsing the comeback. You're not giving the person who hurt you another hour of your interior life. You're just here, in the quiet. And the quiet is enough. That's the destination. Not a dramatic transformation. Not imperviousness to pain. Just this, the ability to be in the quiet without needing to fill it with someone else's offense. Without your mind reaching automatically for the injustice, the slight, the conversation that didn't go the way it should have. The quiet, finally, is yours. Getting here wasn't a single decision. It was 1,000 small ones. The moment you inserted the breath before the response. The morning you spent 20 minutes building your own mental state before anyone else had access to it. The conversation where you held the boundary even though your hands were shaking slightly. The criticism you received without collapsing, examined honestly, extracted what was useful, released the rest. The rejection you survived, felt genuinely, mourned briefly, and then continued past. Each of those moments was a brick. You didn't see the building going up, but it went up. The person standing in this quiet is not the person who started this book. Not because that person was broken. They weren't. They were doing what they knew, reacting to what activated them, carrying weight that belonged to other people, living in a nervous system calibrated for threats that had long since passed. That person was doing their best, and their best got them here, to the edge of something different. What's different now is not that difficult people have disappeared from your life. They haven't. The controllers are still controlling. The critics are still finding fault. The situations that used to hijack your afternoon will keep arriving, because that's the nature of a life engaged with other people and real stakes. What's different is your relationship to all of it. The hook is still there. You're just no longer biting. The work continues. It always will. There will be a situation, probably soon, that finds a nerve you didn't know was still exposed. There will be a person who reaches past your regulation and touches something old and unfinished. You'll react in a way that surprises you, and the measure of what you've built won't be that the reaction didn't happen. It will be how quickly you find your way back to yourself, how much shorter the loop runs before you catch it, how much less of your interior life you surrender before you reclaim it. That speed of return, that shortened distance between being triggered and being grounded again, is the real achievement. not perfection. Velocity of recovery, and it keeps improving as long as you keep practicing. There is no ceiling. Here's the lasting thing. Every time you chose the regulated response over the reactive one, you weren't just managing a moment. You were voting for a version of yourself. You were casting a ballot, quietly and without audience, for the person you intend to become. Those votes accumulate. They compound. They eventually become the person who exists without effort. The person who is simply this way now, who can barely remember what it felt like to be at the mercy of every passing provocation. That person is standing in the quiet tonight, not because nothing can hurt them, because they've learned that the hurt doesn't have to run the show. The room is dark, the house is still. Somewhere across town, the person who once would have kept you up for hours has already forgotten the day. And you, finally, genuinely, at cost, and with practice, and without anyone watching, have let them go.